named Lazarus was sick. He was from Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. This Mary, whose brother Lazarus now lay sick, was the same one who poured perfume on the Lord and wiped his feet with her hair. So the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." When he heard this, Jesus said, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it." And then jumping to verse 17. On his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. And then jumping to verse 20. When Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. "Lord," Martha said to Jesus, "if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now, God will give you whatever you ask." And Jesus said to her, "Your brother will rise again." Martha answered, "I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day." But Jesus said to her, "I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me, even though they die, and whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this?" "Yes, Lord," she replied. "I believe that you are the Messiah, the Son of God, who is to come into the world." After she said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. "The teacher is here and is asking for you." When Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. When the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn there. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" she asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind have kept this man from dying?" Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. "Take away the stone," he said. "But Lord," said Martha, the sister of the dead man, "by this time there is a bad smell, for he has been there for 4 days." Then Jesus said, "Did I not tell you, if you believe, you will see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me." When he said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the dead man came out, his hands and his feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." Therefore many of the Jews who had come to visit Mary and who had seen what Jesus did believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done.
Is that going to stay? Yes, it will. So, before I get into the story, I don't think we've mentioned Pastor Henry's away this week because as elders we've encouraged him to take some weekends, about every 6 weeks, to rest himself and to recharge. One of the elements of that is a step of faith, of trust. For all that we love Pastor Henry and the blessing that he is to us, the things that he does in service of God, he needs his own rest, and we can trust that God will continue to look after our community, and that God has blessed the whole community to contribute and participate in the work that God needs to see done. So we just commend him to his time of trust. I don't know if he's going to pop in and watch this video, so hello. Blessings to you, and we do miss you and look to see you back soon. I want to look at this story. It's a story that I was actually looking at for Friday night at Odyssey House, we sing this song, "You called my name and I ran out of that grave." And it's a great, enthusiastic song, a testimony to how God has blessed us. And we sing it each week, and I was like, better make sure we actually know the story that's being referred to. And as I worked on it, of course, there we sit down in a small group at a table, and it's a little discussion. It's going to be a little different standing up here in front of this large crowd. But as I look through this, of course, so much beauty in this text, so much I could talk about. But the feature that has come out to me is really related to some of what Glenn was saying. Trust, faith, hope. Expectation, perhaps, is a word I would use. So, yeah, let's dig into it and see where God takes us. At the beginning of the story, we just get a little introduction. There was a man named Lazarus, and he was sick. We don't really know who this man is. He was from Bethany. Bethany is a small town about 3 kilometers from Jerusalem. And 3 kilometers, for those who, if you drive 3 kilometers is like nothing. Just imagine if you had to walk from here to St. Luke's. That's how far away it is. It's far enough to be noticeable if you're walking, but it's not really that far. And this is actually coming towards the end of it's just coming up in John's Gospel before Palm Sunday and the triumphant entry into Jerusalem. And then, of course, the events of that whole week ending in the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus. So the tension has been rising between Jesus and the existing religious leadership. And Jesus was in Jerusalem the previous chapter, and they were threatening to stone him. His life was threatened. He's moved away from Jerusalem. He's waiting for the Passover, for the right time, for the next stage of the story. So he's actually quite a long distance away from where Lazarus is. But Lazarus' sisters send word to Jesus. Somehow they know how to get hold of him. And they say, "Lord, the one you love is sick." And that's just a beautiful way to be described, isn't it? The one who Jesus loves. And when he heard it, Jesus says, "This sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son will be glorified through it." And that sets a theme for this whole story. I wanted to jump down mostly into the sort of action bits. There's a lot of talking we skip over with the disciples, as usual, not quite catching on with what's going on, what Jesus is doing. But that does set our theme, that God will be glorified by what happens. And it will not end in death, but actually it does start with death. Right? Lazarus might have been sick for a month. It might have been quite long because Jesus is probably 2-3 weeks away. News has to get to him. News has to come back. He's sick for a month and he's dead for 4 days before Jesus arrives. So you think about his sisters, his family, that's a pretty stressful and difficult time for them. Finally, Jesus does arrive. Martha hears he's coming, walks out to meet him. And the first thing that she says, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." Now, this little interchange, particularly Martha and Jesus, people have all kinds of readings about it because we get these words, but the Bible often doesn't, there's not 25 books of commentaries. We've written all of those later. But it comes to us just this little conversation. So I'm going to, in a sense, put my thoughts on, trusting that the Spirit guides me, and a little bit testifying to the thoughts in my heart as I read this, the things that resonate with me. But I just feel this. I don't think she's angry here with Jesus. It's a remorse is the word. I wish it had been different. Her sadness comes out. But interesting, she just totally takes it as a given. If Jesus was here, Lazarus would not have died. I think that in itself is powerful. And Mary, when she comes out and sees Jesus, what does she say? That's on the next page. Mary says, "If only you had been here." Exactly, basically the same thing. I'm sure the sisters have been saying it to each other. Will Jesus get here? What will happen? If only Jesus had come here. We've had 4 days of if-onlys by this point. Because they expect. And even the people in the crowd, a whole pile of the people in the crowd are like, hey, if Jesus had been here, couldn't he have healed this man? But I'm getting way ahead of the story now. Let's drop back a little bit. So, if only you'd been here, Martha says. But she says, even now God will give you whatever you ask. And I'm always fascinated by that statement. What's she hoping for? Is she hoping that Jesus would raise Lazarus from the dead, or is she just hoping for something positive? It's like, at least you are a wonderful person. I'm so glad you're here and you'll bless us in some way. These details aren't explained to us, but I can imagine she'd love to have Lazarus back, but it's such an outrageous concept, right? We know the story. We know how it ends. There's a little spoiler if you're reading. It's in like verse 7. Jesus already says, look, he's sleeping and I'm going to wake him up. So by the time the reader gets to the story, we know what's coming. But when you're in the story, you don't know what's coming. And even though they have this trust that God could have healed, they have this confidence. But what should I be trusting for in this situation? I think that's a common question we ask. It's not, can God do something, but will God choose to do something? And then that brings in our own uncertainties. Am I good enough that God will do something? Does God love me enough? Well, hopefully we mature and step past that and we recognize that those aren't the key factors. The key factor here really is that God's Son will be glorified. But Martha has, I think, they have this little back and forth. You know, let me go back to the actual text. She says, even now, God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus says, your brother will rise again. Well, there's a promising statement. But Jesus doesn't say, it's all good. Everything's going to be all right. Let's just pop out the back here and I'll raise him from the dead. He says this potentially pious statement, right? Don't worry, you'll see your brother again in the resurrection. We say this kind of thing at a funeral, and it's not untrue, and it's actually very meaningful. But I think Martha will be like, maybe, but maybe not. And what's he saying? So I think she's quite guarded with her response. She says, I know he'll rise again in the resurrection at the last day. I think that's the safe response, right? Maybe Jesus is saying something that I'd love him to say, but the safe response is to go with something theologically correct. Again, something true and meaningful. And of course, we know Lazarus came alive again and died again. And his final hope is in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus then says these amazing words, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. And whoever lives by believing in me will never die. Do you believe this? My focus here is on Martha and what's happening in her heart, but you've got to take a moment to acknowledge these tremendous words. Right? The fourth, I think, of 7 I am statements that structure this whole story that John is telling. Jesus is not just resurrection, but he is the life. He created the world. He sustains the world. Some people even wonder if when they say, if you hadn't been here, my brother would have died, if like you just couldn't die around Jesus, right? Because he is life, very life itself. How could you die in the presence of Jesus? And we still have this hope, our whole hope of resurrection in the end, but also our hope right now of the new life. We have become, if we have chosen to follow Jesus, a new creation. And God is building a new thing. And the church as a community across the globe is like that beachhead, that first landing, that established point from which that new creation is spreading out. So these words are super meaningful to us. But coming back to Martha, what does she say? I believe you are the Messiah, the Son of God who is to come into the world. Super true, super powerful. She's acknowledging Jesus when there's all this tension about who Jesus is. but it says nothing about what he's going to do right now. And I'm sure in her heart, she's like, what do I make of I am the resurrection and the life? And one of the things that I see with what Jesus says, Martha's like, what's happening? What are you going to do? And Jesus says, I am. He doesn't say, I will do this, I will do that. I'm sure I would want that if I was Martha. But Jesus' first statement is who he is. And I think that means to us that we need to focus on who God is first and foremost. And of course, knowing who God is then gives us the confidence to trust. We know the character of God and the nature of God. You know, Mary doesn't have the right to demand that Jesus raise Lazarus from the dead. That's not her choice. It is a blessing that she enjoys in this story, but it's not her prerogative. It's not her choice to make. So, in our lives, we know whatever it is that God chooses, in whatever circumstance, that God is good, God blesses us in so many ways. Not always in exactly the way we're looking for. And I think we have this challenge, and in our hearts we have this uncertainty at times. Anyhow, Martha goes and calls Mary out. Mary comes forward, falls at the feet of Jesus. Mary is always at Jesus' feet, it seems, which is another beautiful place to be. And Jesus, Mary, as I said, first words out of her mouth, if only you had been here. She weeps. Everybody around is weeping. When Mary comes, Martha comes on her own, it seems. Martha's the one in another story who's busy making the world work. And this time, making the world work makes her the first one to come to Jesus. But Mary comes out, and all the people from Jerusalem who've come, it's just a short walk, really. They've come out to support this family. Probably a well-known, a prominent family. And they've all sort of streamed out following Mary. What's happening? Is she going to the grave? Here they come out. And they're weeping, Mary's weeping. And Jesus weeps. Right? It's a famously short statement. Jesus wept. I was actually looking at reading this in a different translation. I couldn't go with a translation that didn't say Jesus wept. It was like Jesus started crying, and it just doesn't have that emotional resonance from hearing that over the years and knowing that our Savior is a Savior who has compassion in our times of need and difficulty. And on Friday night, sitting in the table with the crew at Odyssey, I shared my sense that on the cross, Jesus holds all of that pain and anxiety that have been felt by all the people through all the ages. What's that, Christmas carol? The hopes and fears of all the years in little town of Bethlehem. So Jesus carries all of these. Jesus is weeping, the crowd sees it, but their response is split. Some say, see how he loved Lazarus. And others say, but if he could do this, then could he not, if he healed a blind man, could he not also have healed Lazarus? Now, the way the story is told, there's no way for Jesus to get there before Lazarus dies. So in a sense, the healing question's just out of the picture. But I think the crowd here, the but is important. The crowd is saying, in a sense, exactly what Martha and Mary said. But there seems to be a tone that's different. There's a skepticism. Maybe some of them, they'd heard about Jesus healing a blind man. That's two chapters back in the book of John. They'd heard that story, but they were like, I don't think that's really true. That's a bit far-fetched, isn't it? This man healing people. We're hearing all these stories about Jesus. But is it real? And, maybe it was convenient that Jesus was late. Maybe he just took it slow each day. Took a couple extra days to get there. In fact, if you read some of the bits I skipped, he waited 2 extra days. It might not have made a difference because he was 4 days late. But you hear from the disciples that he waited a couple days. You're a little skeptical. You throw these things. And I think we do this, right? In our head, we're trying to find an interpretation of the things we see. Quite possibly there are people here who are wondering about Jesus. And is this real? Is this true? And it's sensible that you are thoughtful and a little skeptical. But here we also see the people in the crowd. And we see at the very end of the story, Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. And half the crowd praises the Lord. And it says, but some went and told the Pharisees. And I'm sure the news would have got around. But this, again, there's a tone here of some people, they weren't praising the Lord. They were, whatever they made of what happened, they went to tell Jesus' enemies, make sure that they knew what was happening. Again, it's sensible to be a little skeptical, but we don't want to harden our hearts and turn away from what we see. Some people will never be persuaded. So, here we have the crowd being uncertain. And then Jesus turns to Martha again, not Mary, but Martha, and says, roll the stone away. And her faith seems to waver again. She's like, something's happening here. They've gone right out to the grave. Jesus, it's like, Jesus, why does you want to roll the stone away? He's not just wanting to look at the body. That's not a thing you do. So it's an exciting moment, but I think there's also that uncertainty, and she's just uncertain. She does roll the stone away. So I don't want to be all down on Martha here, right? Just this reality of our faith, it's going up and down. We're going into places that our natural mind and heart struggle to go to. But by the grace of God, she goes there. And God is patient with us. He's patient with the disciples who don't really know what's going on. He's patient with Martha. Keeps working with her. So they roll the stone away. And Jesus prays just this simple prayer. Always struck by that. In fact, he never really prays anything about Lazarus. He never says, God raised Lazarus from the dead. He says, God, I trust that you've heard my prayer. I know you have. In fact, I'm only saying anything at all because these people around me need to see. Linked to this concept that God is to be glorified. That's the whole reason that he's doing this. He needs people to know he's talking with God. But yeah, no huge prayer. It's like he's already prayed. Maybe he was praying on his 2 weeks of walking in here, praying for what he should do. But right at the beginning we see he knows that he's going to wake Lazarus up. Because he has the Spirit guiding him. And then, of course, he calls to Lazarus, come forth. Is that just for the crowd around? We don't really know. I sort of picture Lazarus having this moment of disorientation. Where am I? He's got a cloth over his face. He's like, hello? Do you wonder, have I suddenly come awake in a tomb? That's a tremendously scary thought. Although they've rolled the stone away, so there's a bit of light coming in. God could have raised Lazarus in such a way he absolutely knew what was happening. That's pure speculation. But what we do know is he walks out and he has the cloth on his face and his hands are bound. He still has the grave clothes on him. They didn't sort of magically go away. And the crowd, Jesus is like, take those grave clothes off him and let him go. Unbind him is a word that a lot of the translations use. And I think that speaks to us of the role that we can play. Like, who does all the work here? Jesus, God, between them, their oneness, do all the work here, right? Lazarus is really a bit player. He just dies, possibly slowly, painfully, possibly quickly. He dies and is in the grave. All he has to do is sort of walk out. But Jesus is the key player. But the other crowd does have to roll the gravestone away. They do have to unbind the clothes from him. And as I mentioned already, the crowd response was split. So, there's the story recapitulated. As you hear that story, where do you sit? I am expecting there are a few here in the room who see themselves as the crowd. They're bystanders to the drama of Jesus, right? You hear the stories of Jesus from long ago. You see this church community. You're perhaps a little skeptical, wondering, is there a less outrageous explanation for this? I tell you, there is no end of explanations out there. Plenty of people will give you a story Does it hold up that well? I don't think so. Of course, I've made my decision. You need to make your decision. And many people, if you're here at all, you might be still deciding, right? You're thinking about it. And that's a fair place to be. Following Jesus is actually a decision. It's a decision to accept a new understanding of reality. But it's also a decision of loyalty. Jesus doesn't really want people to sort of just believe that he's real. There is that one verse that, even Satan and his angels believe in the reality of God, because there's actually a following God, a joining in with the new creation work that Jesus is doing. So it's a decision that you should approach with due seriousness. But as you hang around our church, I pray and trust that you would see resurrection life. Right? You will see many small episodes, typically not quite as dramatic as the Lazarus story. Large ones, though, small ones. And we have people standing up here and testifying. And we need to continue to do that as these things happen in our lives. Share it amongst the brothers and sisters, but also share it with the people around us. So that you might see some of these episodes, and I pray that you will realize that, in fact, if you see yourself as a bystander, you are also, in a very important way, Lazarus in this story. You are a person who is still in the tomb, who is still dying. Okay? Usually not quite in the tomb when you're dying. Roll with me here. Right? Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. The one who believes in me will live even though they die. Lazarus died again. God willing, the Lord will come again before I die, but that may not happen. And I will die. We've had people die in our church congregation this year. I know that families here, several families have just had so many people die in the last few months, and it's been a deep weight, because this is the reality. The new creation has come but is not yet here. So if you are not, there is no bystander in this story really. If you are not part of Jesus' new creation, then you will be in that tomb. And Jesus offers you this invitation, come forth, come out. And I pray that you would hear his voice. Right? Come up and talk to us at the end. We definitely would be happy to roll the stone away for you, to unbind your clothes, your grave clothes. If you are just in that moment, you're not quite ready to make your decision, you are still thinking, I do encourage you, focus on who God is. We can sometimes, and certainly people like me, right, I'm the kind of person who quite likes school, lots of debate and discussion. Easy to get caught up on little things I don't understand, as if I stand over and above the world and look down in judgment on God himself. No, but who God is. There are some reasonable questions to ask. We can discuss some things. But who God is something we can ask much more than demanding to know and control everything. But most of us in this room here are already following Jesus. Right? That's why we come here. We come here to worship and to celebrate. We come here to celebrate what God has been doing in our lives, to remind each other and to encourage each other with these stories. So we are already the new creation. But as I said, the new creation is very real but not yet complete. And there are still small deaths that we die. And we see people around us also dying these deaths. And I think the first challenge here is, have we called on Jesus? Sometimes we just forget to do that. And when I look at all the players here, so Jesus, we know, he did the big bit. Take Jesus out, what's left of what everyone else did? I think the most important thing is the very beginning of the story. The sisters sent word to Jesus. So first thing is, are we calling Jesus into our lives? Again, into the specific situations. Are we calling Jesus into the lives of the people around us? And I particularly want to note here that often God will reveal to us a specific person where God is ready to move in that person's life, and that person is ready for God to move in that life. Slightly related to that, Alison in Tokyo has been praying for access to a particular apartment building. She wants to meet somebody in that apartment building so that she can maybe start a Bible study in there with a group of ladies, because Bible studies with ladies is a lot of part of what she does. And she's been going to this gym, and she chose this gym as a place where she could meet Japanese ladies. And just this last week, somebody from that gym has given her their contact details, and they live in that apartment building. So I think that's an encouragement to us, and an example of praying that God will make these connections and lead us into the places where he perhaps knows that a Lazarus is. So are we bringing God into our world and the world of the people around us? And then as we look at a situation, are we expecting, or at least open to, resurrection? And we should expect some form of resurrection in the work that God is doing. We don't know exactly what form it takes. I find sometimes that I'm just like, I know that I can't demand God does what I want, and it's easier to almost step back and ignore it. It's like when I was a kid, I gave up on my sister because I was so frustrated. But actually, God encourages us. We have the story of the widow who comes and asks the judge for justice again and again and again. One of our roles to play is just to keep calling on God, waiting on God, being open in our hearts. Right? Remember that these ladies waited probably a month while their brother died. They waited 4 days after that. Tremendous pain and sorrow. It's not all a happy story. It's a happy ending. And we know that God has promised us an incredible ending. And we keep that ending in mind, but we also know along the way we don't know where it's going to go. But it is too easy to just accept. I'm just going to set my shoulder against the sort of wheel. I'm going to push, and I'm not going to ask for anything along the way in the middle. I'll just get through to the ending. But God is at work, and it's important for us to remember that God is powerful. He is continually working. He may not work exactly in this place, exactly the way I expect, but he is continually working, and we should be open and expectant to that. In our own lives, in the lives around us, in a bigger scale. So from my personal thing, I've been challenged, not just this week reading this, but in the last couple of years. When I was like a teenager, I decided that the Western civilization was done. And, I see God at work in Brazil and in China and in Nigeria. And I'm like, one of those countries God is going to bring forward and replace us in the geopolitical scheme. It's taken longer than I expected. But, I have that slightly negative mindset. And there is a role to be a Jeremiah who brings the sort of the warning of what God is doing. And that people need to turn back to God. But we also need to know that God is already rebuilding and renewing. And there are stories in this last year in particular, I'm hearing stories of God's Spirit coming here and there. And they feel too small to be a revival, but in another sense they are. A week or 2 weeks of just this blessing of God on a church community. Not just like one community, but in an area. And none of them are broken out into something huge, but God is at work, and I think it's an encouragement and a reminder. So, we sung right early on, "Blessed be your name." And I want us to just end with that thought in mind. This whole story is about God being glorified. Our lives are about God being glorified. And God doesn't always get glorified in the way that we thought would work out really well for God and for me. I'm great with my plans for God. But I tell you what, I look back in my life and I see God's blessing. And I need to be glorifying him, honoring him in this house of worship. But also in my community, do the people around me know that my heart is dedicated to God? My life is promised to him. And in that, I am seeing his blessing throughout, end to end, all over the place. And we have this hope and just it's a different reality. And I think we are encouraged just to keep that front and center. Not to focus on the bits where it hasn't gone quite like we expected. They're real. We don't ignore them. In that song, blessed be your name in the desert place. When it's difficult, yet still we see the blessing. We see the flowers that do still bloom in the desert. And in a wider community, we see God doing so many things and encourage us. So, God is a powerful and amazing God, the resurrection and the life. May that be true in our lives this week, and may we find an occasion to honor God. Amen.